The frosty air of Aspen, Colorado, wrapped the landscape in a blanket of winter stillness. Snow-laden pine trees framed the sprawling estate of Nathaniel, Nate Williams, a man who seemed to possess everything yet carried a hollowness within him that no wealth could fill. Nate's mansion, perched high in the mountains, glimmered with the soft glow of Christmas lights. Inside, the festive decorations sparkled against the backdrop of modern elegance. Garlands draped over polished banisters, a towering Christmas tree adorned with ornaments, and the faint hum of holiday classics wafting from hidden speakers. Nate sat alone in his study, his silhouette outlined by the flickering fire in the marble hearth. A decanter of whiskey sat on the side table, untouched. He was a man of precision, success, and undeniable charisma, yet his sharp features were softened by a sadness he couldn't escape. 15 years had passed since his daughter, Emily, disappeared without a trace, and the holiday season only deepened the ache of her absence. On the desk before him lay an open file, his company's year-end report. The tech empire he had built stood as a testament to his relentless drive, but tonight, even his achievements felt hollow. A light knock interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant, Grace, peeked through the door. "Mr. Williams, the car is ready to take you to the company party," she said gently, sensing his reluctance. Nate shook his head. "I've decided not to go, Grace. Send my apologies to the team and make sure the bonuses are distributed by morning." Grace hesitated. "They'll understand," but she trailed off, unsure whether to continue. "You've done so much for them this year. They'd love to see you, even if it's just for a little while." "I appreciate that, but not tonight." His voice was firm yet tinged with a kindness that made him impossible to argue with. Grace nodded and closed the door softly behind her. Turning back to the fire, Nate's thoughts wandered to a decision he had made earlier that day. He would leave the grand mansion and spend Christmas Eve in his secluded mountain cabin, a rustic escape nestled deep within the Rockies. It was a place Emily had adored as a child, where they had spent countless weekends hiking, fishing, and stargazing. He longed for the solace the cabin offered, away from the pitying eyes and hollow conversations. As the evening deepened, Nate packed a small bag, including a photograph of Emily that he kept on his nightstand. It was a candid shot, taken on her 8th birthday. Her auburn curls framed her face as she beamed, holding up a snowflake pendant he had given her. The memory made his chest tighten. It was the last gift he had seen her wear. Outside, the snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached his SUV. The winding road to the cabin would be treacherous in the heavy snow, but he welcomed the challenge. It felt symbolic, pushing through the blizzard of his own emotions to find a sliver of peace. As the engine roared to life, Nate cast one last glance at the mansion. The twinkling lights felt less like a celebration and more like a facade, a glittering mask for a home that no longer felt alive. With a sigh, he shifted into gear and began the drive into the mountains, where the silence of the forest and the warmth of the cabin waited to embrace him. The Williams Technologies Christmas party was in full swing. Held at a luxurious hotel ballroom in downtown Aspen, it was the kind of event that employees looked forward to all year. The room sparkled with holiday cheer, golden lights draped across the ceiling, wreaths adorning every wall, and a towering Christmas tree standing proudly in the center. Beneath its branches, a sea of colorfully wrapped presents awaited the traditional gift exchange, an annual highlight of the evening. Laughter echoed as employees mingled, their glasses clinking in toasts to another successful year. While the festive atmosphere was infectious, there was a noticeable absence. Nathaniel Williams, the founder and CEO, had chosen not to attend. Grace, his trusted assistant, had relayed his regrets earlier in the evening, but his absence left a void. As the night wore on, the music softened, and the party organizer, a cheerful HR director named Lisa, gathered everyone around the tree. It was time for the gift exchange. Each employee reached under the branches to retrieve a box, chosen at random. The air buzzed with excitement as ribbons were untied, and paper was torn to reveal thoughtful surprises, scarves, books, and quirky tech gadgets. Meanwhile, high in the mountains, Nate sat in the glow of a small fire in his cabin. It had taken hours to drive through the snowstorm, and now he enjoyed the solitude he had sought. The room smelled of pine and cedar, the fire crackling in the hearth providing the only sound. He sipped from a mug of coffee, his mind wandering to memories of Emily. His reverie was broken by the buzz of his phone. Grace's name lit up the screen. Reluctantly, he answered. "Grace," he said, his voice low. "I thought I made it clear." "I know, Mr. Williams," she interrupted gently. "But something unusual happened at the party. I thought you should know." Nate frowned. "What is it?" "Someone left a gift for you under the tree. It was anonymous." I didn't recognize the handwriting on the tag, but she paused, her voice hesitant. It seemed personal. "I brought it back to the mansion. It's on your desk if you want to see it." Nate's curiosity flickered, though he tried to dismiss it. Probably just a well-meaning employee trying to spread some holiday cheer. Maybe, Grace replied, but it felt different. "You'll understand when you see it." After ending the call, Nate debated whether to leave it for the morning. Something in Grace's tone, however, nodded him. Unable to resist, he threw on his coat and began the drive back to Aspen. The mansion was dark when he arrived, save for the golden glow of the foyer lights. He entered quietly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. On his desk in the study, as promised, sat a small, neatly wrapped box. The paper was deep blue with silver snowflakes, the kind you'd find in any store, but the tag caught his eye. It read simply, "Asterisk for Nathaniel. From a friend, asterisk." He opened it with practiced precision, peeling back the paper to reveal a velvet box. Inside lay a delicate snowflake pendant, its edges glittering with tiny diamonds. His breath hitched. It was unmistakably the same pendant he had given Emily on her 8th birthday, the one she had worn the day she disappeared. Turning it over in his hands, he saw the engraving on the back. Always, Emily. Nate stared at it, his chest tightening as a wave of emotion surged within him. Shock, disbelief, and a faint glimmer of hope. How had it come to be here? Who had left it? And most importantly, why now? He clenched the pendant tightly, his mind racing. The silence of the mansion now felt oppressive, the unanswered questions pressing down on him like a weight. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope, however faintly, that this might be a sign, a connection to the daughter he thought he had lost forever. Nate stared at the pendant for what felt like hours, the firelight casting soft glints on its diamond edges. He turned it over and over in his hand, reading and rereading the engraving. Always, Emily. The words felt like both a comfort and a riddle, taunting him with possibilities he dared not entertain. The weight of the pendant was small, but it bore the gravity of 15 years of grief and unanswered questions. By morning, the mystery had grown intolerable. Nate dialed a number he hadn't used in years, one belonging to Caleb Harris, a private investigator he had once hired in the early days after Emily's disappearance. Caleb was a grizzled man in his late 40s, with a reputation for uncovering the impossible. Back then, even Caleb's tenacity hadn't unearthed Emily's whereabouts. But now, with this pendant in hand, Nate believed the case might finally crack open. The two met later that day in Nate's study. Caleb arrived in his usual understated way, dressed in a worn leather jacket and carrying a small notebook. His sharp eyes missed nothing as he examined the pendant. "You're certain this belonged to her?" Caleb asked, holding the delicate jewelry up to the light. "Without a doubt," Nate said, his voice resolute. "I gave it to her myself. She was wearing it the day she disappeared." Caleb nodded slowly, his fingers brushing over the engraving. "And you say it was left for you anonymously?" "Yes, at my company's Christmas party. No one saw who left it." "Strange." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Something like this doesn't just resurface randomly. Someone wants you to find it. The question is, who?" Nate's jaw tightened. "And why now, after all these years?" Caleb tucked the pendant into a small evidence bag. "I'll start with the obvious. Jewelry like this isn't mass-produced. If it's been sold or pawned recently, someone will have a record. Give me a few days." True to his reputation, Caleb wasted no time. By the following evening, he called Nate with an update. His voice crackled with cautious excitement over the line. "You're not going to believe this, but I traced the pendant to a sale at an antique shop in New York City," Caleb said. "It was sold about 3 weeks ago by a young woman. The shopkeeper didn't get her name, but she was reluctant to part with it. Said she looked like she was carrying the weight of the world." Nate's pulse quickened. "New York? That's halfway across the country." "Yeah," Caleb replied, "but it's a lead. A real one." The next morning, Nate was on a private jet bound for Manhattan. As the plane soared above the clouds, he gripped the armrest tightly, his thoughts churning. New York was a vast city, full of faces and stories. Could one of those faces belong to Emily? Could this lead, tenuous as it was, finally bring him closer to the truth? When the plane touched down at JFK Airport, Nate didn't waste a second. He went directly to the antique shop, a quaint little place nestled in the heart of Greenwich Village. Its wooden sign creaked faintly in the winter wind, and the display window showcased an eclectic mix of trinkets, vintage watches, delicate porcelain figurines, and stacks of well-worn books. Inside, the shop was warm and dimly lit, with the faint smell of aged wood and lavender polish. A bell jingled as Nate entered, and an elderly woman behind the counter greeted him with a kind smile. "Good afternoon," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Looking for something special?" "I hope so," Nate replied, pulling the evidence bag from his pocket. He placed the pendant on the counter. "I was told this was sold here recently." The woman's expression shifted to one of recognition. Yes. I remember that piece well. A lovely snowflake design. Quite unique. Who sold it to you?" Nate asked, trying to keep the urgency from his voice. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she searched her memory. It was a young woman. Late teens, maybe early 20s. She seemed hesitant, as though parting with it was difficult. I asked if it had sentimental value, but she didn't answer. Just said she needed the money. Nate's breath caught. Did she leave a name or contact information? "I'm afraid not," the woman said apologetically. "She paid in cash and didn't stay long. But there was something about her. She had a familiar look. I couldn't place it at the time, but now, seeing your expression, I wonder." "What do you mean?" Nate pressed. The woman hesitated again, choosing her words carefully. It was in her eyes. The way she looked at that pendant before letting it go. It was like she was saying goodbye to something she deeply loved. Nate's heart raced. "Do you remember anything else about her?" The woman thought for a moment, then nodded. "She wore a red scarf. And she mentioned she worked nearby, I think at a cafe. That's all I recall. It wasn't much, but it was a start." As Nate stepped back into the cold New York air, the pendant now felt heavier in his pocket. He looked up at the city skyline, his resolve hardening. Somewhere in this labyrinth of streets and faces, a piece of his past was waiting to be found. The antique shop, with its creaky wooden floors and shelves brimming with relics of the past, seemed to hold a story in every corner. Nate stood by the counter, his imposing presence slightly out of place in the quaint, cluttered environment. The pendant lay on the counter between him and the shopkeeper, Martha, who regarded it with a thoughtful expression. Martha was a petite woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun and a pair of half-moon glasses perched on her nose. Her warm demeanor hinted at years of patience, the kind of person who had seen much and judged little. She picked up the evidence bag containing the pendant, her fingers delicate yet steady. "Yes, I remember this piece," Martha said, her voice soft but firm. "It came into my shop about 3 weeks ago." Nate leaned forward, his tone controlled but tinged with urgency. "What can you tell me about the person who brought it in?" Martha set the bag down gently and folded her hands on the counter. Her name was Eve Parker. Young, maybe 20 or so. She had this air about her, like someone carrying more than her share of burdens. She was hesitant to part with it. I could see it in her eyes, the way her fingers lingered on the chain before she let it go. "Eve Parker," Nate repeated, committing the name to memory. "Did she say anything? Anything at all about where she got it or why she was selling it?" Martha shook her head slowly. "Not much. I asked, of course. I always do when someone brings in a piece like this, something unique and clearly cherished. She just said she needed the money. I didn't press her. It felt delicate, as if asking more might push her to walk away. Nate absorbed this information, his mind racing. Eve Parker. The name was unfamiliar, yet it clung to him like a thread waiting to be pulled. Do you know where I can find her? Martha hesitated, her brow furrowing. I can't say for certain, but I remember she mentioned working nearby. There's a little cafe a few blocks from here, Cozy Corner, I think it's called. She might be there. She seemed like the kind who doesn't stray far. Nate nodded, his focus sharp. Thank you, Martha. You've been incredibly helpful. As he turned to leave, Martha called after him. Mr. Williams, if you find her, tread carefully. She seemed fragile, like she'd been through more than she was ready to talk about. Nate paused, her words resonating. He gave a curt nod before stepping out into the bustling streets of Greenwich Village. The city was alive with the hum of activity, taxis honking, pedestrians bundled in scarves and coats, and holiday decorations twinkling in shop windows. But Nate's mind was elsewhere, his thoughts tethered to the name Eve Parker and the image of a young woman reluctant to let go of a pendant that had defined so much of his grief. The cafe was easy to find. Cozy Corner lived up to its name, a small, inviting space tucked between two brownstones. Through the frosted window, Nate could see a handful of customers seated at wooden tables, sipping coffee or working on laptops. The scent of freshly brewed espresso and baked goods wafted through the air as he stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, searching for someone who might match Martha's description. Behind the counter, a young woman with auburn hair tied in a messy bun was steaming milk for a latte. She wore a red scarf loosely around her neck, and though she was focused on her task, there was a weariness in her posture that caught Nate's attention. Could this be Eve Parker? Could this be the person who had touched the pendant last? Or even, dare he hope, someone connected to Emily? He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her without scaring her away. His grip tightened on the evidence bag in his pocket, the pendant a constant reminder of the stakes. He took a steadying breath and stepped toward the counter, his voice low but steady. Excuse me, are you Eve Parker? The young woman looked up, her green eyes meeting his. For a split second, Nate's heart stopped. Those eyes, they were so familiar, a mirror of Emily's, and yet different, guarded. Eve frowned slightly, as if trying to place him, then nodded. Yes, she said cautiously. I'm Eve. Can I help you? Nate's throat tightened. He had prepared for this moment, yet standing in front of her, words failed him. I think you might be able to. It's about a piece of jewelry you sold recently. A snowflake pendant. Eve's expression shifted. Her guarded demeanor grew even more pronounced, and she stepped back slightly. Why? What about it? I need to know where you got it, Nate said, his voice earnest. It's very important to me. Eve hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if weighing her options. I don't think I can help you, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry. She turned as if to retreat to the back room, but Nate gently placed the pendant's bag on the counter. Please wait. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to understand. Eve froze, her eyes locking onto the pendant. For a moment, her expression softened, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. Then, just as quickly, the wall went back up. I don't know what you're looking for, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's not me. And with that, she disappeared into the back, leaving Nate standing there with more questions than answers. The winter chill of New York City had settled deeply over Brooklyn, blanketing the streets in a thin layer of frost. The neighborhood buzzed with life as locals hurried past Nate, their breath visible in the cold air, bundled in thick coats and scarves. He stood across the street from a narrow brownstone building, his gaze fixed on the small apartment above a laundromat. According to Caleb's follow-up report, this was Eve Parker's address. She lived here alone, in a one-bedroom apartment she could barely afford on her barista salary. For a man accustomed to luxury, the building looked almost dilapidated, chipped paint on the windowsills, a flickering neon sign advertising the laundromat below. Yet there was something grounding about the place. It spoke of resilience, of finding a way to survive against all odds. Nate felt his heart tighten as he imagined a young woman, perhaps barely out of adolescence, trying to make ends meet in a city as merciless as New York. The thought struck him again. She could be Emily. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling since the cafe encounter. Eve's green eyes haunted him. They were so familiar, a mirror of the child he had lost so many years ago. Her movements, her posture, even the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, it all felt like Emily. But Emily had been gone for 15 years. That was a fact he had learned to live with, no matter how much it tore at him. Now, standing here, Nate felt the hope surge again, as terrifying as it was exhilarating. He crossed the street, his boots crunching on the salted pavement, and climbed the narrow staircase leading to the apartments. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking spices and fresh laundry. At the top of the stairs, he found her door, 3C. It was modest, with a faded wreath hanging from the knob, a small attempt at Christmas cheer. Nate hesitated, his hand hovering just above the door. What would he even say? How could he explain why he was here without scaring her? But before he could knock, the door opened. Eve stepped out, a backpack slung over her shoulder and her red scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She froze when she saw him, her green eyes widening in recognition. "You," she said, her voice sharp with surprise. From the cafe, Nate felt his chest tighten. Seeing her up close, with no counter between them, the resemblance was even more striking. Her auburn hair caught the faint light filtering in from the hallway window, and the way her brow furrowed in suspicion sent a pang through him. It was like looking at Emily, not as a child, but as the young woman she might have become. "I didn't mean to startle you," Nate said, his tone measured. I needed to see you again. To talk." Eve shifted uneasily, her hand tightening on the strap of her backpack. "About the pendant?" "Yes," Nate said. "And about you." Her expression darkened, her gaze darting past him as though calculating an escape route. "Look, I don't know what you're looking for, but I already told you, I don't have any answers." "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," Nate said quickly, his voice softening. "I'm here because you remind me of someone I lost. Someone very important to me." Eve's stance faltered, her shoulders relaxing slightly, though her guard was still up. "Who?" Nate hesitated. How could he explain without overwhelming her? He pulled the evidence bag from his pocket and held it out. "This pendant belonged to my daughter. She disappeared 15 years ago. You're the first connection I've had to her since then." Eve's eyes flickered to the pendant, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, and the silence in the narrow hallway grew heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've had that pendant for as long as I can remember," she said. "It was mine. My mother gave it to me when I was little." Nate's pulse quickened. "Your mother?" Eve nodded but looked away, as though the memory was too painful to face directly. "I mean, my adoptive mother. I don't know anything about before. I was adopted when I was 5. The words hit Nate like a lightning bolt. Adopted at 5. The same age Emily had been when she disappeared. "Eve," he said, his voice trembling. "Where did you grow up? Who adopted you?" Eve took a step back, the defensive edge returning to her posture. "Why are you asking me all of this? What do you want from me?" Nate held up his hands, trying to calm her. "I just want the truth. That's all. Please, if you'll let me, I can explain everything. But first, I need to know. Do you remember anything about your life before you were adopted?" Eve hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. "Not much," she admitted reluctantly. "Just flashes. A woman's voice. A warm hand holding mine. And snow. There was always snow." Her words cracked something open in Nate, a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared for. Snow. Emily had loved the snow, and the last day he'd seen her, they had been playing in the fresh powder outside their cabin. "Eve," he said gently, his voice almost breaking. "I think you might be my daughter." Her breath caught, and her eyes widened in shock. "What?" I know it sounds impossible, Nate said, stepping closer. But if you'd let me, I'd like to prove it to you. A DNA test. It's simple, and it could give us the answers we're both searching for. Eve stared at him, her emotions swirling visibly across her face, confusion, fear, and the faintest glimmer of hope. For a moment, she seemed to consider running. But then, as though some part of her wanted to believe, she nodded slowly. Okay, she said, her voice shaky. But if this is some kind of mistake. It's not, Nate said firmly. I promise you, it's not. Eve stared at Nate across the narrow hallway, her green eyes darting to the door behind him as if weighing the option of retreat. Despite his calm demeanor and soft-spoken tone, there was something about him that set her on edge. It wasn't fear exactly, but an unsettling mix of curiosity and unease. Yet, there was also something else, a flicker of familiarity she couldn't quite place, like a melody she'd heard in a dream but couldn't recall. I don't know who you are, Eve said, her voice guarded. And I don't understand why you're so sure about this theory of yours, but I don't have any answers for you. Nate stayed where he was, careful not to push too hard. He could see her apprehension, the walls she had built around herself. I understand how strange this must seem, he said, his voice measured. But I'm not here to hurt you or force anything on you. I just want to talk. Maybe we could go somewhere neutral? A coffee shop. Eve narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Why? So you can try to convince me of something that doesn't make sense? I told you, I don't know anything about before. Nate's gaze softened. I'm not asking for much. Just a few minutes of your time. If after that you want me to leave you alone, I will. She hesitated, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Fine, she said finally. But just a few minutes. There's a diner down the block. Nate nodded, grateful for even the smallest opening. Together, they walked in silence to the diner, its bright neon sign flickering against the evening sky. Inside, the smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeted them, mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Eve led the way to a corner booth, her movements cautious, as though bracing herself for an ambush. A waitress approached, her notepad poised. What can I get you? Just a coffee, Eve said quickly. Nate ordered the same, and they waited in an awkward silence until the cups arrived. Eve wrapped her hands around the mug, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the answers to the questions swirling in her mind. So, she said, breaking the silence. Talk. Nate took a moment to gather his thoughts. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table. 15 years ago, my daughter disappeared. Her name was Emily. She was 5 years old, the same age you were when you were adopted. Eve's hands tightened around the mug, but she said nothing, her expression unreadable. I know it sounds far-fetched, Nate continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. But when I saw you at the cafe, something in me knew. You look so much like her, the way she might have grown up to look. And then the pendant. He gestured to the bag on the table. It can't be a coincidence. Eve exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You don't even know me. You don't know anything about my life. You're right, Nate admitted. I don't. But that's why I'm here. To learn, to understand. If there's even the smallest chance that you might be her, I have to try. Eve hesitated, the guarded look in her eyes faltering for just a moment. I don't remember anything from before I was adopted, she said finally, her voice quieter now. I've tried, but it's all blank. My parents always told me it didn't matter, that I was safe with them, and that's all I needed to know. Do you know anything about your adoption? Nate asked gently. She shook her head. Just that I was found in some town upstate. I don't even know where exactly. The agency said they couldn't trace my family. It's like I came out of nowhere. Nate's heart clenched. The story lined up too closely with Emily's disappearance to ignore. Eve, he said softly, if you'll let me, I'd like to help you find out more. A simple DNA test could tell us everything we need to know. If it turns out I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone. But if I'm right, his voice faltered, the weight of the possibility too much to bear. If I'm right, it could mean everything. Eve stared at him, her expression conflicted. Her mind raced with questions she didn't know how to ask. Something about him, his voice, his presence, stirred a strange ache in her chest, like a memory buried deep. But the idea of opening that door, of confronting a past she had spent years avoiding, terrified her. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can do that." Nate nodded, respecting her hesitation. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'll be here if you change your mind." Eve's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she looked away, her gaze fixed on the snow falling softly outside the diner window. Something about the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with hope, unsettled her. She couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, in some way, he might be telling the truth. The snowstorm outside the diner had intensified, turning the streets into a shimmering, icy labyrinth. Inside, the warmth from the overhead lights and the hum of quiet conversation created a cocoon of stillness. Nate sat across from Eve, watching as she stirred her coffee absently, her gaze distant. Her hesitance was palpable, as if the weight of his words had shifted something deep within her. "You're asking me to believe something impossible," Eve said finally, her voice soft but tinged with a hint of defiance. "That I'm someone else entirely. That my whole life isn't what I thought it was." "I'm not asking you to believe anything right now," Nate replied, leaning forward slightly. "I'm asking you to give us a chance to find out the truth. That's all." She looked at him, her green eyes narrowing as though she were trying to read him. "You're awfully sure about this for someone who just met me." "I am," Nate said, his voice unwavering. "Because if there's even the smallest chance that you're Emily, I can't let it slip away." "Not again." Eve flinched at the raw emotion in his voice, but there was something about the way he spoke, the desperation and hope mingling together, that stirred something unfamiliar in her. She took a deep breath, running a hand through her auburn hair. "And if I say yes?" "Then what?" she asked cautiously. Nate reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, sliding it across the table. "There's a clinic here in the city. They can run a DNA test quickly and discreetly. I'll pay for everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." Eve picked up the card, her fingers brushing over the embossed lettering. Her stomach churned with uncertainty. She didn't know if she wanted answers or if she feared them. But something in her couldn't let this moment pass, no matter how strange it felt. "Okay," she said, almost to her own surprise. "I'll do it. But just so we can both stop wondering." Relief washed over Nate's face, though he restrained himself from showing too much emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea how much this means to me." They agreed to meet the next morning at the clinic. As Eve gathered her things and walked out into the snow, Nate lingered in the diner for a moment, staring at her retreating figure through the window. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, each one a mix of hope and fear. If she was Emily, what had happened to her all those years ago? And if she wasn't, could he bear the disappointment? Meanwhile, Caleb Harris was working tirelessly to untangle the mystery. Back in his office, a dimly lit space cluttered with files and photographs, he pored over the scant details of Emily's disappearance. He had spent the past few days retracing every lead, digging into adoption records, and reaching out to old contacts in law enforcement. The pendant had opened a door to possibilities he hadn't considered in years, and he was determined to walk through it. Late that evening, Caleb received a call from a retired social worker who had handled cases in upstate New York during the early 2000s. She mentioned a peculiar case from around that time, a young girl, approximately 5 years old, found wandering near a river in a small town called Cedar Grove. The girl had no identification and seemed unable to provide much about where she came from. She was placed in foster care, then adopted shortly after, the social worker explained. "I always wondered about her. She was such a quiet, sweet child, but there was something unsettled about her, like she knew more than she let on." Caleb's pulse quickened. "Do you have the name of the family who adopted her?" "I'll have to dig into my old files," she said. "But if it's the same case you're looking into, I'm happy to help." As Caleb hung up, he couldn't ignore the growing certainty in his gut. The pieces were starting to fit together. He sent Nate a brief update via text, promising more information soon. For the first time in years, the case felt alive again. The next morning, Nate and Eve met at the clinic. The process was quick and professional, the staff taking swabs from both of them with practiced efficiency. Eve remained quiet through most of it, her arms crossed as though shielding herself from the weight of what they were doing. Nate watched her carefully, his heart pounding with every second that passed. When it was over, the technician assured them the results would be ready in a few days. As they stepped back out into the crisp morning air, Eve looked at Nate, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what I'm hoping for," she admitted. "Neither do I," Nate said honestly. "But whatever happens, you won't have to go through it alone." Eve nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary before she turned and walked away. Nate stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd, his chest heavy with anticipation. Somewhere, the truth waited, and it would change everything. The clinic was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of Nate's fingers against his leg. He sat in the sterile waiting room, his chest tight with anticipation. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead only heightened the tension, and the cold tile floor beneath his polished shoes felt more solid than the ground he stood on emotionally. Every passing second felt like an eternity, the weight of 15 years condensed into these last few moments. Across from him, Eve sat rigid in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a storm of emotions she couldn't yet name. A door opened, and a technician stepped into the room holding a folder. Nate stood instantly, his heart pounding as if it might burst from his chest. The technician glanced between him and Eve, her face neutral, professional, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, as though she grasped the gravity of what she was about to reveal. "Mr. Williams, Miss Parker," she said, her voice calm and steady. "The results are ready. If you'd like to step into the consultation room, we can discuss them privately." Eve hesitated, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, but she followed Nate into the smaller, more intimate space. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the walls were adorned with nondescript paintings meant to put patients at ease. They had the opposite effect. Nate sat in one of the chairs, but Eve remained standing, her posture defensive. The technician set the folder on the desk and opened it. She flipped through a few pages before stopping, her gaze lifting to meet Nate's. "The test results confirm a biological match. Miss Parker, you're Nathaniel Williams's daughter." For a moment, the words didn't register. The room seemed to tilt, and the air felt too thick to breathe. Nate's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Eve, his vision blurring with tears he didn't bother to hide. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Emily." Eve flinched at the name, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. She took a step back, as though the declaration had physically struck her. "No," she said, shaking her head. That can't be right." "It's true," Nate said, rising from his chair. He approached her slowly, his hands trembling. "You're my daughter. You're Emily." Eve's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile the impossible truth. The memories she had suppressed for so long felt like shadows on the edge of her consciousness, just out of reach. She wanted to deny it, to push it away, but the look in Nate's eyes, the raw, overwhelming love and recognition, made it impossible. "I don't remember," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't remember you. I don't remember anything." Nate's heart broke at the pain in her voice, but he closed the distance between them, his arms moving instinctively to embrace her. At first, she stiffened, her body tense and resistant. But as he held her, his voice a gentle murmur, she began to unravel. "It's okay," Nate whispered. "You don't have to remember everything right now. You're here, Emily. You're alive. That's all that matters." Slowly, Eve let herself lean into him. The warmth of his embrace was unfamiliar, yet there was something comforting about it, something that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but her head rested against his shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, she let herself believe. But the moment passed, and the weight of the revelation pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. She pulled away abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield against the flood of emotions. "I don't know who I am," she said, her voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of these gaps, these flashes of things I can't explain. And now you're telling me that everything I thought I knew is a lie." "It's not a lie," Nate said gently. "It's just a different story than the one you were told. And I'll help you piece it together, Emily. I'll help you remember." "I don't even know if I want to remember," she snapped, her frustration spilling over. "What if it's too much? What if it's worse than I can handle?" Nate stepped back, giving her the space she needed, but keeping his voice steady. "You don't have to go through it alone. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Eve's gaze softened, but her expression remained conflicted. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into the possibility of a father who had spent years searching for her. But the fear of what she might uncover still loomed, an unrelenting shadow. "I need time," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to figure this out on my own." Nate nodded, his heart aching but understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." Eve turned and walked out of the room, her steps hurried and her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Nate watched her go, the pang of separation sharp, but his heart was full of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Emily was alive. She was here. And no matter how long it took, he would be there for her, ready to help her find her way back. The bustling energy of Manhattan roared outside the cafe window where Vanessa Sinclair sat, her gloved fingers gripping a porcelain cup of tea. Despite the warmth of the cafe, her presence seemed to chill the air. Dressed in an elegant black coat and a scarf of deep crimson, she exuded an aura of control. Her steel-gray eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room as if searching for threats in the most ordinary of places. On the small table before her lay a newspaper folded to an article about Nathaniel Williams, with a photograph of him exiting a clinic earlier that week. She hadn't needed the article to know what had happened. The DNA test. It was the moment she had been dreading for years. Vanessa's perfectly composed expression faltered for a moment as her mind drifted back to the night everything had changed, 15 years ago, when the world had shifted under her feet. It had been winter then, too. The snow had fallen in thick, relentless waves, muffling the sound of her footsteps as she carried the trembling child through the woods. Emily had been so small, her wide, tear-filled eyes shining with confusion and fear. Vanessa had whispered promises to her that night, promises of safety, of love, of a new life far from the chaos. But now, the girl who had once been under her care was no longer an innocent child. She was Eve Parker, and Vanessa's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble. Her phone vibrated on the table, pulling her back to the present. She picked it up, her movements deliberate and graceful. The name on the screen read, "Private Line." Pressing the call button, she brought the phone to her ear without a word. "They've made contact," the voice on the other end said. It was a man, his tone clipped and professional. The DNA results confirmed it. Eve Parker is Emily Williams. Vanessa closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "I know. I've been following the developments." "What do you want to do?" the man asked. "If this continues, the truth will come out. It won't just affect her, it will affect you. Everything you've built, everything you've done." "I know what's at stake," Vanessa snapped, her voice cold but controlled. "You don't need to remind me." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the man spoke again, his tone softer this time. "She doesn't remember, does she?" "No," Vanessa said, her gaze hardening. "At least, not yet. But it's only a matter of time. And Nathaniel won't stop. He never could let things go. What's the plan?" Vanessa's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, though it lacked any warmth. "The plan remains the same. I'll handle it." She ended the call and slipped the phone into her coat pocket. The truth was a delicate thing, easily shattered and even more easily weaponized. For years, Vanessa had lived in the shadows, ensuring that Emily Eve never learned the full story of her past. She had been the one to shield the girl from the pain, to offer her a new life when no one else had. And now, Nathaniel Williams was threatening to unravel everything. Vanessa rose from her seat, leaving the newspaper and half-finished tea behind. As she stepped into the cold street, her heels clicking against the pavement, she felt the familiar pull of determination. She would not let this reunion destroy what she had fought to protect. The next day, Vanessa's shadow loomed over Nate and Eve like a storm cloud. Nate had arranged to meet Eve at a small park in Brooklyn, hoping to take the next step in reconnecting with her. He had brought photographs from Emily's childhood, a scrapbook he had kept meticulously over the years. Eve arrived hesitantly, bundled in her red scarf and a worn coat. Her eyes darted around, still cautious, still unsure. "I wasn't sure I'd come," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I'm glad you did," Nate said, his tone warm. He opened the scrapbook, pointing to a picture of Emily as a toddler in a field of sunflowers. "This was her. This was you. You loved this place. It was your mother's favorite." Eve stared at the photo, her face unreadable. She wanted to feel something, a spark, a memory, but all she felt was an ache she couldn't explain. Unbeknownst to them, Vanessa watched from a distance, her expression unreadable as she stood partially obscured by a row of trees. Her sharp gaze flicked between Nate and Eve, her mind racing. She knew this was a dangerous moment. The more time they spent together, the more likely Eve would remember. Vanessa's hand tightened around her phone as she considered her next move. She had to intervene, but carefully, without revealing her hand too soon. For now, she would wait. But not for long. As Nate and Eve continued to talk, oblivious to the watchful eyes of Vanessa Sinclair, the first cracks in the carefully concealed truth began to show. And Vanessa, desperate to protect the past, would stop at nothing to keep it buried. The warm, inviting atmosphere of the therapist's office contrasted sharply with the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside Eve. She sat stiffly on a plush couch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and soft classical music played in the background, meant to ease patients into vulnerability. Dr. Lillian Harper, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and an air of practiced calm, sat across from her in an armchair, a notebook balanced on her knee. "This is your space, Eve," Dr. Harper said gently. "You can share as much or as little as you want. We'll take this at your pace." Eve nodded but didn't speak immediately. She wasn't sure where to begin or even if she wanted to. Her entire world felt upended. The DNA test had confirmed what Nate claimed, yet accepting that she was Emily Williams, a child who had been lost for 15 years, felt impossible. And then there was Vanessa. The flashes of memory she'd been experiencing since reconnecting with Nate were growing stronger, and Vanessa's face lingered at the edge of her thoughts like a ghost she couldn't banish. Finally, Eve broke the silence. "I've been having dreams," she said hesitantly. "Or maybe memories. I don't know. They feel real, but blurry, like looking through fogged glass." Dr. Harper tilted her head slightly, her pen poised over the notebook. "Tell me about them. Start with what you can remember." Eve exhaled shakily, her gaze fixed on the patterned rug beneath her feet. "It's always winter. There's snow everywhere. I'm running and I'm scared, but I don't know why. There's a woman with me." She paused, her brows knitting together. "Vanessa. I didn't recognize her at first, but I know now it's her. She's pulling me through the woods, and she keeps telling me to stay quiet." Dr. Harper's pen moved swiftly over the page. "What happens next?" Eve's voice grew quieter, as though speaking the words might make the memories too real. "We come to a river. It's half frozen. She's holding my hand, but I slip. I fall into the water." Her breath hitched, and she wrapped her arms around herself tightly. "It's so cold. I can still feel it like knives all over my skin." She pulls me out, and I'm crying, and she just keeps saying, "It's okay, Emily. It's okay." Dr. Harper leaned forward slightly, her expression calm but attentive. "And then what happens?" Eve shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. Everything goes black after that. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Eve's words settling between them. Dr. Harper set her pen down and spoke gently. That's a lot to remember, especially if these memories have been buried for so long. It's not uncommon for trauma to block out certain details. Your mind might be protecting you from something it wasn't ready to process before. Eve nodded, wiping at her eyes. But why would Vanessa? Why was she there? Why would she take me? I don't understand any of it. Dr. Harper leaned back, her tone thoughtful. These are questions that may take time to answer. It's important not to force the memories. They'll come as you're ready. Later that evening, Eve recounted the session to Nate over dinner. They sat in a quiet corner of a small Italian restaurant, the warmth of the brick oven and the soft hum of conversation creating a cocoon of privacy. Nate listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to determination as Eve described her fragmented memories. She pulled me out of the water, Eve said, stirring her pasta absent-mindedly. She kept calling me Emily. She must have known who I was all along. Nate's jaw tightened. If Vanessa knew you were Emily, then she's been hiding you from me. For years. Eve glanced at him, her eyes uncertain. Do you think she hurt me? Or took me for some reason? I don't know, Nate admitted, his voice low. But we're going to find out. Whatever Vanessa's role in this, she owes us answers. Eve hesitated, her mind still grappling with the memories. It doesn't make sense. I don't feel like she hurt me. It's like she was trying to protect me from something. Or someone. The thought lingered between them, unsettling and unresolved. Nate's instincts told him there was more to Vanessa Sinclair than met the eye. She wasn't just a stranger with a connection to Emily's past. She was a key player in the mystery of his daughter's disappearance. Later that night, Nate called Caleb Harris to share the new revelations. Caleb, already neck-deep in his investigation, promised to dig deeper into Vanessa's background. I don't like this, Nate, Caleb said over the phone, his tone grim. This woman sounds like trouble. And if she's been keeping Emily Eve hidden, you can bet there's a reason she doesn't want the truth to come out. Nate stared out the window of his apartment, the city lights glittering like stars against the night sky. She's hiding something, he said, his voice firm. And I'm going to find out what it is. As Eve drifted off to sleep that night, the faint edges of her memories began to resurface once more. The snow, the river, Vanessa's voice echoing in her mind. But there was something else now, a new fragment breaking through the fog. A man's shadowed figure, standing in the distance, watching as Vanessa carried her away. The image jolted her awake, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time, she realized that Vanessa might not have been the only one involved in her disappearance. Nate stood in the dimly lit corner of the rooftop terrace, the city sprawling behind him like a tapestry of glittering lights. His breath fogged in the crisp night air as he waited, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He had received the anonymous note just hours earlier, slipped under his door. Asterisk, we need to talk. Tonight? Come alone, asterisk. He wasn't surprised when Vanessa Sinclair stepped out of the shadows. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago mastered the art of controlling a narrative. Her tailored black coat and sleek boots lent her an air of sophistication, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her usual calm demeanor. Vanessa, Nate said, his voice clipped. I assume you're here to explain yourself. She arched an eyebrow, her expression cool and measured. I'm here to give you the truth, though I doubt it's the version you want to hear. Nate took a step closer, his gaze piercing. You kept my daughter from me for 15 years. You think I care about your version of the truth? Vanessa's composure wavered for the briefest moment, but she recovered quickly. It's not that simple, she said, her tone sharp. Nothing about that night was simple. Then explain it to me, Nate demanded. What were you doing with Emily? Why did you take her? Vanessa crossed her arms, her breath escaping in a visible plume. I didn't take her, she said firmly. I saved her. If it weren't for me, she wouldn't even be alive right now. Nate's eyes narrowed, his voice low with restrained fury. What are you talking about? Vanessa hesitated, glancing away as if the memory itself was difficult to confront. It was a winter storm, she began, her voice quieter now. The snow was relentless, the kind that buries everything in its path. I was driving through Cedar Grove, taking the back roads to avoid a blocked highway, when I saw her. She was just a tiny figure in the woods, running barefoot through the snow. I stopped the car and followed her, calling out, but she wouldn't stop. Her gaze hardened, and she met Nate's eyes again. She ran straight onto the ice of a frozen river. Before I could reach her, the ice gave way. I heard her scream as she went under. Vanessa paused, her voice trembling as she continued. I pulled her out, Nate. She was barely breathing, her skin so cold it felt like glass. I carried her to my car and drove straight to my cabin. There was no time to call for help. By the time I got her warm and conscious, she couldn't even tell me her name. All she could do was cry. Nate listened, his heart pounding with every word. And you didn't think to call the police? To report her missing? I did, Vanessa said sharply. At first, I called the local authorities, but when they asked for more details, where I found her, who she was, they dismissed me. Said it was probably nothing, that she'd been abandoned by her family. They said they'd send someone to check the area, but they never did. Her tone grew bitter. She was just another lost child to them. But to me, she was more than that. I couldn't leave her to chance, to a system that wouldn't care for her. So, yes, I made a decision. I took her in. I gave her a home, a new name. I gave her a life. Nate's fists clenched at his sides. You stole her life, Vanessa. You stole her from me. I saved her, Vanessa repeated, her voice rising. She was a terrified, broken little girl. I did what I thought was best. She didn't remember you. She didn't ask for you. All she wanted was to feel safe, and that's what I gave her. Nate shook his head, his anger bubbling over. You had no right to make that decision. I was out there searching for her, desperate to find her. You had no idea what you were taking from me. Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes flashing. And what would you have done, Nate? Paraded her back into your perfect life as if nothing had happened? You don't know what she went through that night. She was traumatized, scared of everything. Do you think she would have been better off with you, drowning in your guilt and grief? I would have given her everything, Nate said fiercely. I would have given her the life she deserved. The life she was meant to have with her family. Vanessa's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes. You think I didn't love her? She whispered. You think it was easy for me to let her go? Nate's voice dropped, cold and steady. Love isn't hiding someone away from the people who love them. Love isn't making decisions for someone else's child. Whatever your intentions were, Vanessa, you crossed a line. And now, the truth is coming out. You can't stop it. Vanessa's composure cracked, and she turned away, her arms wrapping around herself as though shielding against a cold only she could feel. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. If she remembers everything, it won't just hurt her, Nate. It will destroy her. Nate frowned, a chill creeping up his spine. What are you talking about? Vanessa didn't answer. She stepped back into the shadows, her face obscured, but her final words hung in the air like a warning. Be careful what you uncover. Some truths are better left buried. And with that, she disappeared into the night, leaving Nate standing alone, more determined than ever to uncover the full story of what had happened to Emily and what Vanessa was so desperate to hide. Caleb Harris sifted through the boxes stacked in the corner of Nate's home office, each one marked with dates and labels like Search Efforts 2009 and Emily's Drawings. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside and the occasional rustle of paper. Nate had called him earlier that morning, insisting they revisit every shred of evidence from the early days of Emily's disappearance. Vanessa's cryptic warning had left him restless, and he was determined to find answers. After an hour of searching, Caleb's fingers brushed against a small leather-bound book. Its faded pink cover was worn at the edges, and a tiny golden clasp held it shut. He recognized it instantly, Emily's diary. He glanced at Nate, who was leaning against the desk, deep in thought. Found something, Caleb said, holding up the diary. Nate's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "That's hers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She carried it everywhere. I thought it was lost when she disappeared." Caleb carefully opened the clasp and flipped through the pages. The handwriting was that of a child, uneven and sprawling, with doodles in the margins. The first few entries were mundane, notes about her favorite toys, her friends at school, and her love for snowy days. But as Caleb reached the middle of the diary, the tone shifted. "Listen to this," Caleb said, his voice low. "There's a lady I see sometimes. She wears a red coat. She watches me from the woods." Nate's brow furrowed, and he stepped closer. "What?" Caleb continued, his finger tracing the words. "I told Mommy about her, but she said it's probably just someone walking their dog. But I don't think so. She doesn't smile or wave. She just stands there, watching." Nate's stomach twisted as Caleb turned the page. More entries followed, each one mentioning the lady in the red coat. "She was there again today," Caleb read. "By the cabin this time. I don't like the way she looks at me. It's like she's waiting for something." Nate's breath quickened. "Vanessa. It has to be her." Caleb nodded grimly, his expression dark. She was watching her even before the disappearance. She knew Emily. She planned this. Nate ran a hand through his hair, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. She didn't just stumble upon Emily by chance that night. She was following her, waiting for the right moment. Caleb closed the diary and set it gently on the desk. If Vanessa was stalking Emily, we need to know why. This wasn't random. She's hiding something bigger. Determined to dig deeper, Caleb made a call to one of his contacts in law enforcement, requesting access to any records tied to Vanessa Sinclair. Meanwhile, Nate sat down and picked up the diary, his hands trembling slightly. As he read through the entries, his heart ached with every word, every fear his daughter had put into writing. One entry in particular stopped him cold. "Mommy and Daddy are going to the big city tomorrow. The lady in the red coat was outside the cabin again today. I hope she doesn't come back while they're gone." Nate's voice broke as he read aloud. "We left her. We went to the city for a business meeting, and we left her there." Caleb placed a hand on his shoulder. "You couldn't have known, Nate. You had no idea she was being watched." "But I should have," Nate said, his voice raw. "I should have protected her." As the weight of guilt threatened to overwhelm him, Nate forced himself to refocus. "We need to confront Vanessa again. She has answers, and I'm not stopping until I get them." That night, as Caleb continued his investigation, Nate sat alone in the dim glow of the office, the diary open in front of him. Each page felt like a window into Emily's world, a world he had been locked out of for 15 years. And through it all, the figure of the woman in the red coat loomed larger and more menacing, a shadow that had stolen his daughter away and left behind a trail of unanswered questions. But now, armed with this new piece of the puzzle, Nate felt a renewed sense of purpose. Vanessa had been in the background all along, and it was time to bring her into the light. Nate stood in the dimly lit living room of his Manhattan apartment, the weight of Emily's diary still heavy in his mind. He had confronted Vanessa earlier that day, demanding answers, and to his surprise, she had agreed to meet him that evening. Now, as the clock ticked closer to the appointed time, he found himself pacing the room, his frustration and desperation mounting. When the knock finally came, it was sharp and deliberate. Nate opened the door to find Vanessa standing there, her expression unreadable. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her coat brushing against the doorframe as she moved. She looked composed, but Nate could sense the tension simmering beneath her calm facade. "Thank you for coming," Nate said, though his voice was taut with restrained anger. Vanessa arched an eyebrow. "I doubt you gave me much of a choice," she replied coolly, taking a seat on the couch. "You're relentless when you want something." "And what I want," Nate said, sitting across from her, "is the truth. No more deflections, no more vague warnings. The truth, Vanessa." Vanessa sighed, removing her gloves and placing them neatly on the coffee table. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "You want the truth? Then listen carefully, because it's more complicated than you think." Nate leaned forward, his eyes locked on her. I knew Sarah, Vanessa began, her tone softening. Your wife. Long before you ever met her. The words hit Nate like a cold wind, and he froze, his mind scrambling to process this unexpected revelation. What? He managed to say. Vanessa's gaze turned distant, as though she were sifting through memories she hadn't revisited in years. Sarah and I were friends in college. We were close, inseparable for a time. But after graduation, our lives went in different directions. I pursued my career, and she met you. Fell in love. Built the life she always dreamed of. Nate's stomach churned, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. It wasn't until years later, after she'd had Emily, that we reconnected, Vanessa said. It was by chance. We ran into each other at a charity event. She looked happy, radiant even. But as we talked, I realized something was weighing on her. She was worried, terrified, really, about what might happen to Emily if something ever happened to her. Why would she be worried about that? Nate asked, his voice sharp. We were fine. We had everything under control. Vanessa gave him a pointed look. Did you? Because from what Sarah told me, you were consumed by your work. You were barely home, always chasing the next deal or the next opportunity. She felt alone, Nate. She was scared that if something happened to her, Emily would be left adrift, without the kind of emotional support a child needs. Nate's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. And what does that have to do with you? Sarah asked me to promise, Vanessa said, her voice quiet now. She asked me that if anything ever happened to her, I would look after Emily. Make sure she was safe, loved, protected. Nate stared at her, disbelief etched into his features. That's insane. Why would she ask you? I'm her father. I would have been there for her. Vanessa's eyes softened with something that looked almost like pity. Maybe she didn't trust you to be there the way she thought Emily would need. Or maybe she was just scared. But whatever her reasons, she made me swear, Nate. And I did. Nate shot to his feet, pacing the room as anger surged through him. You had no right to take that promise seriously. She was my daughter, Vanessa. Mine. You stole her from me. Vanessa stood as well, her voice rising with an edge of frustration. I didn't steal her. I kept her safe when no one else could. When Sarah died, I knew Emily would need more than what you could give her. You were broken, Nate. Grieving, consumed by your loss. Do you honestly think you could have given Emily what she needed back then? Don't you dare try to justify this, Nate shot back, his voice shaking. You kept her from me. You lied to me. You took 15 years of her life away from me, and for what? Because you thought you knew better. Vanessa's composure cracked, and for the first time, her voice wavered. I loved her, Nate. I loved her like she was my own. I did what I thought was best for her, and I won't apologize for that. The room fell into tense silence, the weight of Vanessa's confession pressing down on both of them. Finally, Nate spoke, his tone low and resolute. You might have made a promise to Sarah, but you had no right to take Emily away from me. None. And I will find out the full truth, Vanessa. Every piece of it. Vanessa looked at him, her expression unreadable once more. The truth is messy, Nate. It's not as simple as you want it to be. But if you're determined to dig it up, then be prepared to face what you find. With that, she picked up her gloves and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet apartment. As the door clicked shut behind her, Nate stood in the middle of the room, his emotions a chaotic storm. He had the answers he had demanded, but they only raised more questions. What had Sarah been so afraid of? Why hadn't she trusted him to protect their daughter? And what else was Vanessa hiding? Nate vowed to uncover every detail, no matter how painful, because the one thing he knew with absolute certainty was that he couldn't let Vanessa's version of the story be the final one. The early morning light streamed through the windows of the cafe where Emily sat across from Nate, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Over the past week, Nate had made every effort to reconnect with her, scheduling small, quiet moments like this to bridge the years they had lost. He had shown her photographs, shared stories about her childhood, and even taken her to a park she used to love. But despite his warmth and sincerity, Emily still felt a wall between them. She sipped her tea, watching him from behind the mug. He seemed older than she'd first realized, with faint lines etched around his eyes and streaks of gray in his dark hair. His gaze held a mix of hope and vulnerability, and she wondered how much of that was for her and how much was because of the guilt he carried. "Is it weird?" Nate asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Being here with me, I mean." Emily set her mug down, considering her words carefully. "It's not weird, just different. I'm still figuring out how I feel about all of this." "That's fair," Nate said, nodding. "I can't even imagine how overwhelming it must be. I just want you to know. I'm not trying to force anything. I just want to give you the space to be yourself, whoever that is now." His words were genuine, and for a moment, Emily felt a flicker of connection. But before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking when she saw Vanessa's name. "I need to take this," she said, grabbing the phone and stepping outside. The chill of the winter air hit her as she answered. "Vanessa, I was wondering when you'd finally pick up." Vanessa's voice came through, smooth and calm, but with an edge of frustration. "It's been days, Eve. Or should I say Emily now?" Emily winced at the sarcasm. "You know this is a lot for me. I needed time to think." "And what have you been thinking?" Vanessa asked. "That your long-lost father will swoop in and fix everything? That 15 years of abandonment can be wiped away with a few heartfelt conversations and family photo albums." "It's not like that," Emily said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Isn't it?" Vanessa pressed. "He's trying to rewrite the past, Eve. Trying to make himself the hero in a story he wasn't even around for. You don't owe him that." Emily leaned against the cold brick wall of the cafe, her breath visible in the frosty air. "It's not about owing anyone. I want to understand where I came from, who I was before." Vanessa's tone softened, but her words remained pointed. "I get that, but don't let him guilt you into being something you're not. He's carrying years of regret, and whether he admits it or not, he's going to put that on you. You'll end up being a way for him to heal himself, not the other way around." Emily closed her eyes, her chest tightening. "It's not that simple. He's trying, Vanessa. He's trying to connect." Vanessa's silence stretched for a moment before she responded. "And what about me? Did you forget everything I did for you? I raised you, Eve. I was the one who held your hand through nightmares, who made sure you had a home, a life. Does none of that matter now?" "Of course it matters," Emily said quickly, guilt twisting in her stomach. "I didn't ask for any of this, Vanessa. I didn't ask to be caught between you and him." Vanessa's voice grew softer, almost pleading. "You don't have to choose, Eve. But don't let him make you forget who you are. You're not just Emily Williams. You're the person you became, the person I helped you grow into." Emily swallowed hard, her thoughts churning. She couldn't deny that Vanessa had been there for her, that the life she'd known had been shaped by her. But now, standing on the edge of a past she couldn't fully remember, she felt torn in two directions. When she returned to the cafe, Nate looked up, concern etched into his face. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Emily said, forcing a small smile as she slid back into her seat. "Just complicated." Nate nodded, his eyes searching hers. "If you ever need to talk about it, I'm here. No pressure." Emily nodded, but she couldn't ignore the growing weight of doubt in her chest. Both Nate and Vanessa claimed to have her best interests at heart, yet their conflicting truths only made her feel more lost. Who was she supposed to trust? And more importantly, who was she supposed to become now that her entire identity was fractured between two lives? As the conversation with Nate continued, she found herself holding back, unsure of what to say or how to feel. And as she walked home that evening, Vanessa's words echoed in her mind, making her question whether she could ever truly find peace in a world where she didn't fully belong to either past or present. The winter wind howled through the trees surrounding Nate's secluded cabin, a rustic refuge that had once been a place of joy and family memories. It stood silent in the darkness, the fresh snow untouched around its perimeter, until the faint glow of orange flames began to lick at the edges of the wooden structure. Within moments, the fire grew, crackling fiercely as it devoured the aged timbers. Nate was jolted awake by the sound of a loud pop, followed by the acrid smell of smoke. His heart raced as he scrambled out of bed, throwing on a jacket and grabbing his phone. The living room was already engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly as the windows shattered from the heat. "Fire," he yelled, coughing as the smoke thickened. He stumbled toward the door, barely able to see through the haze. The heat was unbearable, the flames roaring like a wild animal. Somehow, he made it outside, collapsing into the snow and gulping in cold, clean air. He turned back to see the cabin he'd cherished for years consumed by the inferno, the fire reflecting in his wide, horrified eyes. His hands trembled as he dialed 911, the operator's voice a distant murmur as he relayed the emergency. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. The cabin was reduced to smoldering ruins, a few charred beams standing like blackened skeletons against the night sky. Nate stood at a distance, his breath visible in the cold air, watching in stunned silence. The fire chief approached him, his expression grim. "We'll do a full investigation, but this doesn't look like an accident," he said. "There's evidence of accelerants around the perimeter." Nate's stomach dropped. "You mean, someone did this on purpose?" The chief nodded. "That's what it looks like. Do you know anyone who might have a reason to target you?" One name immediately came to Nate's mind, but he didn't say it aloud. He simply shook his head and muttered, "I don't know." The next morning, Nate called Caleb. Within hours, the investigator was on the scene, walking the snowy perimeter with his usual keen eye for details. Caleb's gaze hardened as he examined the scorch marks and the faint chemical smell lingering in the air. "This wasn't random," Caleb said, standing beside Nate near the ruins. "Someone wanted to send a message." Nate nodded, his jaw tight. "Vanessa. It has to be her. She's been trying to keep me from Emily since the beginning." Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crouched down, examining a partially burned object near the edge of the wreckage. It was a scrap of fabric, red and singed at the edges. He held it up, his face grim. "She was here," he said quietly. "Red," Nate murmured, his fists clenching. "The coat. She's always wearing that damn coat." Caleb straightened, his expression dark. "This isn't just sabotage, Nate. It's desperation. She thinks she's losing control over Emily, and this is her way of trying to scare you off. Or worse." "Worse?" Nate's voice was sharp, his frustration boiling over. "What's worse than destroying the last place I had with my daughter?" "Using fear to push Emily away from you for good," Caleb said. "She's trying to isolate her, make her believe you're dangerous or incapable of protecting her. If Vanessa convinces Emily that being with you is a mistake, she wins." Nate took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We can't let her get away with this. Emily deserves the truth." Caleb nodded, pulling out his phone. "I'll dig into Vanessa's movements over the past few days. If she was here, I'll find proof. And when I do, we'll make sure she faces the consequences." Meanwhile, Vanessa sat in a dimly lit room, her red coat draped over the back of a chair. She stared into the fire crackling in the hearth before her, her expression unreadable. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up, her fingers tightening around the device. "It's done," a voice on the other end said. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. And the cabin? Completely gone. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Good. The longer Emily stays with Nate, the more dangerous it becomes. She's not ready for the truth. The voice hesitated. "You know this won't end it, right? Williams isn't the kind of man to back down." Vanessa's eyes opened, her gaze steely. "Then I'll make sure he has no choice." Back in the city, Emily stood on the balcony of her apartment, her phone clutched in her hand. Nate had called earlier to tell her about the fire, but she couldn't process it. The cabin he had described with such fondness, the place she'd seen in his photographs, was gone. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had spent the past few days feeling torn between Nate and Vanessa, but now the stakes felt terrifyingly real. Whoever had done this, if Vanessa was truly behind it, had gone too far. Her phone buzzed with a message from Nate. "Asterisk, I need to see you." We need to talk about Vanessa, asterisk. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. Everything was spiraling out of control, and she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. The fire was a warning, a declaration of war, and she was caught in the middle of it. As she stared out at the city skyline, one thought consumed her. She needed to uncover the truth for herself, no matter what it cost. The city of Chicago greeted Emily with a sharp wind that cut through her coat as she stepped off the bus. The sky was a steel gray, the streets bustling with the energy of late December. She clutched her small duffel bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the pendant tucked safely in her pocket. It was the one constant in a sea of chaos, the only tangible connection she had to the life she was trying to piece together. Emily had left New York in the dead of night, slipping away without telling Nate or Vanessa. Her heart had been a storm of conflicting emotions, their voices echoing in her mind. Nate's pleas for her to let him in, Vanessa's insistence that she remember who she was with her. The weight of their expectations had become too much. Now, standing in a city she had chosen at random, Emily felt both free and lost. She had no plan, no clear direction, but that was what she needed: space to think, to figure out who she was away from the people pulling her in opposite directions. She found a small, affordable room in a hostel on the edge of downtown. The bed was hard, the radiator clanked noisily, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls, but it was hers for now. As she unpacked her bag, the pendant fell into her hand, the intricate snowflake design catching the dim light. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling its cold weight. Later that week, while wandering the streets, Emily came across a community center tucked between two old brick buildings. A hand-painted sign on the door read, "Warm Hearts Shelter, Volunteers Welcome." Something about the name tugged at her. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. Inside, the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. The space was warm and bustling with activity. Volunteers handed out meals, sorted clothing donations, and chatted with the guests, many of whom huddled around tables for warmth. A woman approached Emily, her kind face framed by dark curls and a knit hat. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I was wondering if you need any help," Emily said, her voice tentative. The woman smiled. "Always. I'm Lydia, the coordinator here. We could use someone to help in the kitchen or sort donations, if you're interested." Emily nodded, relief washing over her. "I'd like that." Within hours, Emily found herself slipping into the rhythm of the shelter. She served hot meals, folded clothes, and listened as guests shared their stories. The work was exhausting but grounding, giving her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. At night, she sat in the small office Lydia had lent her as a makeshift break room. She would pull out the pendant and run her fingers over the engraving. Always, Emily. Questions swirled in her mind, but she didn't know where to start finding the answers. One evening, Lydia joined her, 2 steaming cups of tea in hand. "You've been a big help here," Lydia said, passing her a cup. "But I can see you're carrying something heavy. Want to talk about it?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pendant. "It's complicated," she said finally. "I found out something about my past. Something huge. But now I don't know who I am or who to trust." Lydia sipped her tea thoughtfully. "When the ground beneath you feels shaky, it's hard to find your balance. But sometimes, stepping away gives you a new perspective. That's why I came here," Emily admitted. "To figure out who I am, without anyone telling me what to think." "That's a good start," Lydia said with a gentle smile. "But remember, you don't have to do it alone. The answers will come when you're ready for them." As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to find small moments of clarity. She realized how much she valued connection, not just with Nate or Vanessa, but with the people at the shelter who trusted her with their stories. Yet the questions of her identity loomed larger than ever. Was she Emily Williams, the daughter of a man who had searched for her for 15 years? Or was she Eve Parker, the person Vanessa had raised and shaped? Could she be both, or was she something entirely new? The city outside her window was a blur of lights and noise, but in the quiet of her small room, Emily held the pendant close and whispered the same question she asked herself every night. Who am I? In the flickering candlelight of his Manhattan apartment, Nate sat surrounded by boxes of memories he had collected over the years, photographs, drawings, mementos of Emily's childhood. Caleb had called him that afternoon with a discovery so unexpected it had left Nate speechless, a letter written by Sarah. Caleb arrived moments later, carrying a carefully sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with age. He handed it to Nate without a word, his expression somber. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Sarah's elegant, looping script, spelling out Nate's name. I found it tucked inside one of Emily's old storybooks, Caleb explained. The one from the cabin. It must have been overlooked all these years. Nate's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The ink was slightly faded, but Sarah's words were still clear, her voice preserved in every line. My dearest Nate. Asterisk if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me. I don't want to imagine that day, but I know life can be unpredictable, and I want to be sure Emily is cared for no matter what, asterisk. Nate's breath caught, his eyes already misting as he read. Asterisk, I need you to know how much I love you, and how much Emily loves you. You are her father, her rock, and her protector. But I also know you, Nate. I know how much you push yourself, how much you bury your pain in work. If something happens to me, promise me you won't let that pull you away from her. She needs you more than she'll ever be able to say, asterisk. He paused, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Caleb stood silently nearby, giving Nate the space he needed. Asterisk, I've asked someone to help, someone I trust. Vanessa Sinclair. You remember her, don't you? We were close in college, and though life took us in different directions, she has always been someone I could count on. Vanessa knows that if anything happens to me, her role is to help protect Emily. But, Nate, this is important. She's not meant to take your place. You are Emily's father. You are her true guardian. Vanessa is there only to support you, not replace you, asterisk. Nate's heart clenched, Sarah's words resonating deeply. She had trusted Vanessa, but only as a secondary safeguard, never as a replacement. Asterisk, please don't let grief consume you. Be the man I know you can be, the man Emily will always look up to. You are stronger than you think, Nate, and Emily will need your strength more than ever, asterisk. The letter ended simply. With all my love, always. Sarah. Nate lowered the letter, his hands shaking. He felt a storm of emotions, grief for Sarah, anger at Vanessa, and an overwhelming determination to honor Sarah's wishes. She trusted Vanessa, Nate said quietly, his voice rough. But not like this. Vanessa twisted it into something else entirely. Caleb nodded, his expression grim. This changes everything. Vanessa kept this from you, Nate. She knew what Sarah wanted, but she made her own rules. She took control when she never should have. Nate folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Emily deserves to see this, he said. She needs to know what her mother wanted for her. Caleb hesitated. Do you think she's ready for that? She's still figuring out who she is. Nate looked out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. Maybe not. But this isn't just about her finding out the truth. It's about her knowing how much she was loved by both of us. Miles away, in Chicago, Emily sat in the quiet of the shelter's office, turning the pendant over in her hands. The snow outside fell softly, muffling the city's usual noise. She felt the weight of questions she couldn't answer, the pull of two worlds that didn't seem to fit together. She had spent her life believing she was Eve Parker, but now Emily Williams lingered in every corner of her thoughts. And somewhere, deep in her heart, she wondered if the answers she was searching for were already waiting for her to embrace them. As Nate held the letter close, he knew this was a turning point, not just for him, but for Emily. Sarah's words had given him something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. Whatever lay ahead, he would fight for Emily with everything he had, not just as her father, but as the protector Sarah had always believed he could be. The bustling streets of Chicago were muted under a blanket of fresh snow as Nate's car pulled up to the modest shelter where Emily had been staying. The gray skies above seemed to mirror his swirling emotions: hope, apprehension, and a lingering anger that Vanessa was in the car with him. She sat in the passenger seat, her red coat striking against the cold backdrop, her expression unreadable. "I still don't think you should be here," Nate said, his voice sharp as he killed the engine. Vanessa turned to him, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Emily needs to hear the truth from both of us. You don't have the monopoly on her life, Nate. That's rich, coming from you," he snapped, stepping out of the car and slamming the door. Vanessa followed without a word, her heels clicking against the icy pavement as they approached the shelter. Inside, the warmth of the space and the hum of activity stood in stark contrast to the tension between them. Nate scanned the room until he saw her. Emily stood near the kitchen, her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled up as she helped organize donations. She looked different here, more grounded, more certain of herself. Yet when she turned and saw them, the flicker of surprise and unease in her expression revealed the storm she was still navigating. "Nate," she said, her voice steady but cautious. Her eyes shifted to Vanessa, narrowing slightly. "And Vanessa, both of you. What are you doing here?" Nate took a tentative step forward. "We need to talk, Emily. About everything." Emily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "I don't think there's much left to say. I needed space, and I thought I made that clear." "This isn't about intruding on your space," Nate said. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the letter. "I found this. It's from your mother, Sarah." Emily froze, her gaze locked on the envelope. "What is it?" "It's her words," Nate said softly. "What she wanted for you. For us." Vanessa stiffened, but said nothing, her eyes flicking to the letter as if it were a weapon poised to strike. Emily stepped forward and took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. The room seemed to hold its breath as she read, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion and then to something raw and vulnerable. When she finished, she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "She trusted both of you. But this doesn't make sense. Vanessa, you were supposed to help, not take over. And Nate, where were you? Why weren't you there when I needed you?" Nate's heart sank at her words, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Emily, I didn't know. I was grieving, and I let myself believe that someone else would keep you safe when I couldn't. I failed you, and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I want to make it right." Vanessa stepped forward, her voice calm but insistent. "And I did what I promised your mother I'd do. I kept you safe. I gave you a life when no one else could. Everything I did was out of love for you, Emily." Emily's gaze darted between them, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You both keep saying it's about me, but all I hear is what you wanted. Your guilt, your promises, your need to fix things." She took a deep breath, her hands tightening around the letter. "But what about what I want? What about who I am?" "Then tell us," Nate said gently. "Tell us what you need." Emily hesitated, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. "I need time," she said finally. "I need space to figure out who I am without either of you telling me. I've spent my whole life being shaped by other people, and now I need to decide for myself." Nate opened his mouth to protest, but Vanessa cut in, her voice softer now. "If that's what you need, Emily, then I'll respect it." Nate shot her a glance but nodded reluctantly. "I'll respect it too. But just know, wherever you go, whatever you need, I'll be here." Emily's lips curved into a faint smile, bittersweet and fleeting. "I know." As she walked toward the door, the letter still clutched in her hand, Nate and Vanessa stood in silence, both watching her leave. The weight of their choices, their mistakes, and their love for her hung in the air. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she was standing on the edge of something new, not someone else's expectations, not a fractured past, but her own future, waiting for her to define it. The soft glow of Christmas lights reflected in the frosted windows of Nate's Manhattan apartment. The tree stood in the corner of the living room, its ornaments glimmering against the gentle flicker of the fireplace. Nate sat on the edge of the couch, his phone resting on the coffee table in front of him. The weight of silence pressed down on him, each second stretching into an eternity. It was Christmas Eve, and the absence of a response from Emily was like a void he couldn't fill. She had left Chicago weeks ago, retreating further into the space she had demanded to find herself. He respected her decision, but the waiting was agony. Despite the time apart, he'd spent every day holding onto the hope that she would reach out, that she would find her way back to him. A sudden buzz shattered the stillness. Nate's heart jumped as he snatched the phone, his hands trembling. The message was simple, but it brought tears to his eyes. Asterisk, I'll be home for Christmas. Asterisk. Nate let out a shaky breath, his chest tightening with a mixture of relief and joy. He stared at the message, reading it over and over, as if the words might disappear if he looked away. Without hesitation, he began to prepare. The kitchen came alive with the sense of cinnamon and pine as he baked the cookies Emily used to love as a child. He brought out the photo albums, arranging them on the coffee table, and carefully placed a single wrapped gift beneath the tree. The hours seemed to crawl by until finally, there was a knock at the door. Nate moved quickly, almost tripping over his own feet as he reached for the handle. When he opened the door, there she was, Emily, bundled in a thick coat and her signature red scarf. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her eyes glistened with emotion. In her hands was a small suitcase, a symbol of her decision to return. "Hi," she said softly, her lips curving into a hesitant smile. "Hi," Nate replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stood frozen for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Emily entered, her gaze sweeping over the apartment. The warmth of the space, the decorations, and the faint hum of a Christmas carol playing in the background felt welcoming, like stepping into a memory she hadn't realized she missed. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Nate admitted, closing the door behind her. "I wasn't sure either," Emily said, turning to face him. "But I thought about everything. About you, about Vanessa, about me. And I realized I don't have to choose one life or the other. I can build something new, something that feels true to who I am now." Nate's eyes filled with tears. "And you want to do that here? With me?" Emily nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, but on my terms. I want to take things slow, to figure out what it means to be a family again." "Whatever you need," Nate said, his voice firm with conviction. "I'm here for you, Emily. Always." She smiled, a little more brightly this time, and set down her suitcase. "There's something else," she said, glancing at the tree. "Vanessa. She's still part of my life. She was there for me when I didn't have anyone else. But I also know she made choices she shouldn't have. She's going to have to accept that I need boundaries." Nate hesitated but nodded. "If that's what you want, I'll respect it. As long as you're safe and happy, that's all that matters." Emily walked over to the tree, her fingers brushing against one of the ornaments, a tiny snowflake that Nate had hung the night before. It reminded her of the pendant she still carried, now tucked safely in her pocket. "This feels right," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "Coming back. Starting over." Nate joined her by the tree, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's not about forgetting the past," he said. "It's about finding a way to move forward. Together." The evening passed in a blur of warmth and laughter. They shared stories, looked through old photographs, and talked late into the night. Emily's presence filled the apartment with a sense of completeness Nate hadn't felt in years. When she finally fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, Nate sat beside her, watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time: hope. Emily was home, and though the road to healing was long, they would walk it together. The first rays of Christmas morning streamed through the frost-covered windows of Nate's apartment, casting a golden glow over the room. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments glittering like tiny jewels. Beneath it, the single-wrapped gift Nate had prepared for Emily waited, its red ribbon tied neatly into a bow. The scent of pine and fresh-brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the warmth of the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, her face lit with quiet wonder as she examined the snowflake pendant. It dangled delicately from a hook Nate had fashioned near the top of the tree, catching the light like a fragment of frost kissed by the sun. She had decided to hang it there the night before, an unspoken agreement between her and Nate that this symbol of her past would now represent her future. "It fits perfectly," Emily said, her voice soft. "It's where it belongs," Nate replied, standing behind her with a mug of coffee in hand. He took a seat beside her, the quiet moment between them rich with unspoken gratitude. They had spent the morning in simple celebration, sharing a breakfast of scrambled eggs and pancakes shaped like Christmas trees. Nate had made them clumsily, and Emily had laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Now, as the morning unfolded, the sense of peace between them felt fragile but real. Nate handed her the gift beneath the tree, his hands trembling slightly as he said, "I thought you might like this. It's not much, but it's something I thought we could start new traditions with." Emily untied the ribbon and peeled back the paper to reveal a leather-bound journal with her name embossed on the cover. She ran her fingers over the letters, her heart swelling at the thoughtful gesture. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought you could write your story in it," Nate said. "Your story in your own words. Whatever feels right to you." Tears pricked her eyes, and she leaned over to hug him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. As they sat together, flipping through the empty pages of the journal, the doorbell rang. Emily stiffened slightly, glancing at Nate. "That's Vanessa," he said gently. "She called earlier. She wanted to stop by, just for a moment." Emily nodded, her emotions conflicted but steady. "It's okay. Let her in." Nate opened the door to find Vanessa standing there, her red coat buttoned tightly against the cold. She held a small gift bag in her hands, her usual air of confidence softened by a tentative smile. "Good morning," Vanessa said quietly. "I hope I'm not intruding." Nate stepped aside, and Vanessa entered, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Emily. The younger woman stood by the tree, her arms crossed, but her expression calm. "Vanessa," Emily said, her voice neutral. "Emily," Vanessa replied, taking a step forward. "I didn't come to disrupt anything. I wanted to see you, to say Merry Christmas, and to apologize." Emily's brows lifted in surprise, but she stayed silent, letting Vanessa continue. "I know I overstepped," Vanessa said, her voice steady but filled with regret. "I let my love for you cloud my judgment. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I made choices that weren't mine to make. For that, I'm sorry." Emily studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "I appreciate that, and I won't forget everything you did for me. But we both need to move forward, and that means boundaries. I need space to figure out who I am." Vanessa smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. "I understand, and I'll always be here if you need me." She handed Emily the gift bag and said her goodbyes, leaving the apartment with a quiet dignity. As the door closed behind her, Nate placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. Emily nodded, her gaze drifting back to the snowflake pendant on the tree. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I am." The rest of the day passed in warmth and laughter. Nate and Emily shared stories, baked cookies that burned slightly at the edges, and even watched a cheesy Christmas movie that made them both laugh until they cried. As the evening settled in, Emily found herself sitting by the fire, her journal in her lap. She opened it to the first page and wrote a single line. "Today is the first day of the rest of my story." Nate watched from across the room, his heart full. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt whole. The snowflake pendant sparkled on the tree, a symbol of resilience, renewal, and the unbreakable bond between father and daughter. And though the journey had been long and filled with pain, they were finally home, together, ready to face whatever the future held.